Hello, everyone. Welcome to the October 2013 Professor Messer A+ Study Group. It is our monthly study group, the time when we take your questions and we answer them, or at least we try to. We try to go through them. I get a lot of questions. It can be a little bit difficult to go through every single one of them since there are a few hundred to parse through. But I've tried to take the ones that you've sent me over the last week, the last month, in the chat rooms, in your emails, and I've added them to this list of things. And we stream this live. So if you are watching this live, or you would like to, you can always find out what's going on at our Professor Messer calendar. You can also go to our website and learn more about the replays available. You can watch all of the replays for this on the Professor Messer website. We have quite a bit to go through today, as usual. But first, before we get started, I want to remind you that we do have quite a few things that you could find on the Professor Messer website. Of course, we have our free videos, which you can find for A+, for Network Plus, for Security Plus, and all of those other things. We also have a YouTube you can subscribe to, and every time I put a video out, you have the option to be notified that I put a new video on YouTube. And if people ask me all the time, how can we help? Can we contribute money? I don't take donations to the site, but I absolutely take your subscriptions. It's a great way to help support what we're doing, and you would be surprised how far that actually goes. It's a pretty big deal on the Google side on YouTube, and it allows them to see exactly what we're doing here at the Professor Messer website. You can also follow me on Twitter. There's the daily pop quiz, of course. I'm watching the chat room on the Professor Messer website. So if you're watching this on the YouTube side, I don't have a way to watch that chat on YouTube, but if you go to professormesser.com/live, you can not only join us live there, but you can participate in the chat room at the bottom of the screen. And of course, if a lot of people want some discounts on their certifications, you can find discount information at professormesser.com/vouchers. Okay, that's a lot. Let's talk about also, I got a few questions about this particular item this week. This is the CE credits. If you already have a CompTIA certification and you're joining our study groups and you would like to accumulate CE credits towards renewing your certification, you've already registered and you're part of CompTIA's CE program, then you can watch this live event and get credit for it. You can learn all about that on the CompTIA website, on the renewal site. And if you are someone who needs that, you need a document from me, you need something that I have provided to you saying, yes, you did attend, and I have everybody's information in here. So you can absolutely send me a request for that, and I'll be glad to send out information so that you can say, yes, you were here, and I can sign off on that. Well, we do this every month, and there were a number of topics that you sent in to me this month that were repeated from last month. So rather than repeat what we did on last month's, let's talk about what we did. So you can go back and watch the replay and learn about how to install dual channel memory. You can almost see that through my head on the screen. How to install the dual channel memory. How do you set up and run a virtual machine? Which computer components are assigned with an IRQ? What's the best book to study for the A+ exam? All right, I'm going to repeat that one later on in the stream. How can I run a virtual version of iOS and Android, which is really cool. If you've not done that before, you can do it right on your computer screen. Very, very useful if you're studying for your A+. How much time should you wait in between taking your A+ exams? When will I know I'm ready for the exam for sure? And what do the performance-based A+ questions look like? So before we go to the calls, I'll make everybody aware there is a call-in number. You can call in on Skype for absolutely free at 855-235-4742. You'll find that number underneath the professormesser.com/live page, right there under the stream video. You'll see the 855-235-4742 number. Now, before we go there, let me also remind you of what's new. All of the 800 series videos are now on the Professor Messer website. They are also downloadable as well. I have offline versions that you can purchase. You can watch them all online for free, of course. But if you'd like to take them on a plane, you'd like MP3 files, you'd like to have PDFs of all the slides, you can find information on how to purchase those at professormesser.com/downloadable-A+. And of course, there's transcripts and closed captioning, which has been really great. I'm going to keep doing that with all of my videos. It's nice to have people in other countries be able to follow along. It's difficult if English isn't your first language, but if you see it written on the screen, it makes so much difference. And these are not the YouTube transcripts and captions. I had a third party type out these transcripts, so they are almost 100% accurate. And when I find inaccuracies, I can go in and tweak those a little bit. So that becomes really, really useful to have that there. Okay, before we get too far, of course, that dial-in line is there. The 202 area code has been holding for a while, since before we even started this event. So let's go off to 202. Hello, caller. Are you on the line? Let's see if the caller's listening. This is the great part about having this enormous staff that you see in my facility. Here's my staff. Here's all of them running around. You can see we have a lot going on with the staff. It's me. So I'm not only the call screener, I'm also the host. See how that works? But think of all the money we're saving. So I know you're there, 202. I'm going to flip over to you. Maybe you'll hear the beep. There's a little beep that you'll hear in your ear, but you have to listen to the call and not listen to the stream, because the stream is about 30 seconds behind. So you will run into challenges when trying to watch it, and then suddenly I'm there and gone. Nothing ever happened. But we give people who aren't calling in also an opportunity to participate. I have things for you to do as well. And the thing that I'd like you to do is to vote. We have questions that I like to ask during the study group. And the first question, this will get us warmed up, that I always ask is, how long have you been studying for your A+ certification? You can vote and go out to, or on your mobile device even, go out to vot.rs or pop open a new browser window and go to vot.rs, vote.rs, and enter the number 975187. And if you have a QR code reader that you have installed on your mobile device and you've wondered, what am I ever going to do with this QR code reader, because nobody seems to be using QR codes anymore? It was a big fad there for a while. Well, here's a decent QR code use, is you can point your mobile device at the screen and it will take you right to the page that would allow you to see all of those questions that we pop up, and I'll have those available. So if you have a QR code reader on your mobile device, that's a quick way, or just go to vot.rs and you can enter 975187. Now, when you get there, you will see quite a few options, and I've broken it out to be less than a month, 1 to 3 months, 3 to 6 months, 6 to 9 months, and 9 to 12 months, and more than a year. So I'm really interested in knowing about what you are doing with your certifications. This helps me not only get the content just right for these study groups, but it's nice to know who's out there and watching these things live, so we can get a feel for exactly the types of things you might be seeing for your certification. And you can see here, I get immediate feedback. The screen just changes as you begin voting. This is really useful not only to have here now, but if you're watching this on the replay, this will still be here. So you can go back and you'll see everybody's response, but at least if you wanted to vote and contribute as well, you could put it in there, because I do look at these before doing my next study group. I go back and look at these numbers just to make sure that I'm on track. So it's nice to have a feel for exactly who's watching these. And I think it's nice that everybody else can see who's watching these and the type of testing that you've done on those pieces. And we have a pretty good mix. Usually there's a bit of a curve there near the top, and it narrows off there near the back. But you can see we almost have a flat line across this on this particular study group. People that have been studying for less than a month, 6 people, the same 6 people, another same number, 6 people, not the same 6 people for more than a year, but at least the same number. We got almost a flat line across for people that have been doing this for a while and people that have really just started along these lines. And as you're sending me in the questions, I can see some of that in the question you're sending along. So feel free to keep going through and looking at some of those questions. And I'm going to have many questions for you throughout the stream. I've got pop quiz questions that really are going to see how much you know about the A+ topics. So it's not going to be just a survey question. You're going to have to know some content, and then we'll talk about that content once we get there. So make sure you keep your mobile device, your QR code reader, or your extra screen available to vote on the next ones. And we'll come back and look at some of these in just a bit. Now, I have also an update, because I'm still getting some folks telling me or asking me, there's a new test, isn't there, for the A+? There absolutely is. There used to be a 700 series exam. Now there is an 800 series exam. The 800 series exam is a completely different format than the 700 series. The content is very similar. The content is about 80 to 85% exactly the same content. A lot of the older technologies are no longer on the exam. A lot of newer technologies are now on the exam. So there is some new content, and we got rid of some old content. So if you've been studying for the 700 series, you're probably going to want to update yourself with the changes before you go in and look at this. And we'll talk about ways to do that later on the live stream. You can see also a big difference in the format. It used to be that some topics were spread over the 801 exam, the 802 exam, or the first exam and the second exam. Now they are structured so that PC hardware, networking, laptops, printers, and operational procedures are in the first exam, and then operating systems, security, mobile devices, and troubleshooting are in the second exam. So you really got to focus on networking in the first, and not as huge of a focus on networking in the second, really more of security in the second piece. Also, of course, you can see mobile devices, a brand new set of topics for the 800 series exam. That's something that we weren't expecting to see a lot of on the 700 series, but obviously a huge need today. Just in the last few years, we've seen that huge growth in mobile devices and bring your own devices to work, which some people say is great, some people say not so great, but there it is. We still have to manage those pieces, and as someone who is managing technologies in the enterprise, you're going to need to know how to manage all of those, and so mobile devices was added. There have been a lot of questions, the chat room's already talking about it, about Windows 8. A lot of people asked me in the questions I received this week, is there Windows 8 on the exam? Because we've had Windows 8 now for over a year. There's even updates to Windows 8 about to be released, version 8.1. So currently, if you look at the exam objectives, Windows 8 is nowhere on there. Just Windows 7. Windows 7, Windows XP, and Windows Vista. Those three. Used to be Windows 2000 was in the 700 series, not there anymore. So you need to know Windows XP, Windows Vista, Windows 7. Now, what happened when the 700 series came out way back when, 4 or 5 years ago, when it was being put together and finally released? It was about 4 years ago, just under that, or 3 to 4 years ago. The exam objectives did not have Windows 7 in them. And about a year later, CompTIA updated the exam objectives to add Windows 7. They added IP version 6. They added a couple of other things as well. They changed some of the security options. So they didn't change the exam numbers. They simply slipstreamed, updated, changed the exam objectives with no fanfare. They didn't announce anything. They didn't tell anybody it happened. Suddenly, you had Windows 7 show up on the 700 series exam. So I would not be surprised if CompTIA does exactly the same thing with Windows 8 or a similar thing where you wake up in the morning and suddenly Windows 8 is part of the exam. So before you go to take your exam, you should go through and absolutely look at the exam objectives. And we'll talk about later on in this stream how to do exactly that. We will look at the exam objectives and get a feel for exactly what we need to know for our exam information. So just a few things to keep in mind as you're planning to take your 800 series. And if you're watching the stream and really studying for the first time and you're thinking exam objectives, what are you talking about? We will absolutely fill you in on that as we go through the live stream. So let's go through a number of questions that you have sent me. This first one is actually some new content. I didn't do some specific video content on this one, so this will be something new that you don't have when you watch my A+ videos. First, let's have a question. Let's go through and see what the question is. What type of memory uses space on a storage device to increase available RAM? And specifically, the storage device in this case would probably be something like a hard drive or an SSDs. But what type of memory uses this space to increase the available RAM? And you have a number of options available to you. If you go to vot.rs and go to number 275684, do not answer in the chat room. No answering in the chat room. You cannot say in the chat room, it's a secret. We will figure out what it is because the options I have available to you are ECC, DDR, virtual, EEPROM, and RAM bus. So you have a number of options, more than 4. You have 5 options to choose from. It's only one of these. Is what type of memory uses space on the storage device to increase available RAM? This is one of these things that when you start trying to understand how operating systems work, this is an important thing to know about for those pieces. So I'm going to hide the results from all of you, and then we're going to flip over to this page. So what type of memory uses free space on a storage device? Let me add Change a view of this so we can see it a little bit bigger on the screen. There we go. Maybe even make it even bigger than that. What type of memory uses free space on the storage device, increase available RAM? ECC, DDR, virtual, EEPROM, and RAM bus. We've got a few options available to be able to see that. Now, which one is it that you are going to want to use? That's when I get into trying to break these things out and understand what's going on inside of the operating system. This will be an important consideration. So as we go through here, your number is 275684. And thanks for putting the link out in the chat room. Very, very useful to be able to just click on that in the chat room. And I have so many arms moving, I just don't have time to do that. We've got about 39 respondents, so let's see what people have put. I'm going to now show the results, and we got really one that is really what everybody said. 31 people have said virtual memory is the type of memory that uses free space on a storage device, but some of you said ECC and DDR. ECC is the error correcting memory, so that is not quite what we're looking for. DDR is not quite, that's a type of memory, certainly, but it is not kind of memory that's on a storage device like a hard drive or an SSD. Electrically erasable, programmable read-only memory, not quite the same. We might use that for other purposes inside of our computer, but not to increase available RAM in our computer. And RAM bus, no, that's not quite the same thing either. So free space on a storage device would be the thing that we are interested in. And the free space on a storage device really goes back to understanding more about how these paging files on Windows actually work. The question from William this month actually said, what do I lose if I shrink the paging file? Well, that is a question that many people are very passionate about. Some people say you can just get rid of the paging file in the operating system and it will run much faster. Other people say you really need the paging file to be able to keep your system up and running. So which is it? Well, before we talk about the answer to this question, let's take a step back and think about what a paging file really is. It's all about performance. Windows calls this virtual memory. And the virtual memory inside of a system, you can find the settings for this in Windows Vista and Windows 7 and Windows XP. I think it's in a similar place as well. Control panel system, and there's an advanced system settings, and inside of there will be a performance tab, and inside of that is an advanced setting for the performance information. This is a setting that normally we set up to have Windows manage on its own. In fact, it's kind of hard to see here. If I scroll up, let's see. Can I scroll up? There's an option in Windows to automatically manage the paging file size for all drives. You can kind of see it there without my head being in the way. And you can set up how much room on a drive would be used for the paging file. Might be nice just to show it to you. I think I even have a system running right now so I can show you where this is through the magic of virtual systems. Let's flip over and have a look. There it is. So this is Windows 7. I know it's kind of hard to see, but it really is Windows 7. There's my start button. Start, and we can go to our control panel. And in our control panel, I have system, my system settings. Under system, there is up at the top, advanced system settings. There it is. And under that, there's an advanced tab. And under that is a performance option, visual effects, processor scheduling, memory usage, and virtual memory. Virtual memory. That's exactly what we're interested in. And if I look at the settings, you can see the performance options there for the virtual memory, and under the advanced tab and data. These are all of the things that you would have to deal with when working with virtual memory. The virtual memory option on mine automatically managed the paging file size for all drives. So let's go back to that question we asked, which was, all right, what in the world is virtual memory? What are you talking about? What is that really used for? If you ever look at the root of your drive, that root directory, you'll very often see a very, very large file called pagefile.sys. And pagefile.sys is an area set aside on your hard drive or on your storage device that is specifically designed to take memory from your RAM, pages of memory, and change them, move them from actual working RAM inside of your system and store them instead on your storage device. That's why we call it a paging file. We're taking pages of memory and transferring them over. Well, obviously, that seems a little bit odd because, as you're probably aware, you can only run applications, you can only execute code, you can only do something on your computer if it's in RAM. If we're taking it out of RAM and we're sticking it on your hard drive, we can't do anything with it, can we? No, you can't. And that's the whole point, actually. If we are taking things out of memory and storing it on our drive that we're not using, we've put it in the background, we've minimized it, we can grab parts of that application and Windows realizes, well, you're not using this, you just minimized it. It's behind this window you're currently using, and we're running out of memory. We're running out of RAM inside of our system. Let's take some of the things you aren't using and stick them on your hard drive. And that way, we've now got more room on our computer to do other things. RAM is freed up, and we've got plenty of room to work with now. Then if you happen, you've probably seen this, you go down to that minimized application and you click it, and it comes back up, but it doesn't come back up immediately. There's a little bit of a delay, just a tiny little delay as it moves the paging information from your storage device and puts it back into operating memory. So some people will say, well, that's a delay I can't deal with. I don't like waiting for this paging because hard drives obviously are much slower than actual RAM. Obviously, SSD is a little bit faster and being able to work with that, but this was really designed for hard drives and how we had all of that available hard drive space. That's when we first started using this virtual memory. If we disable it, obviously we're not going to have any more virtual memory available, which means we can only use the physical RAM that's inside of our computer, which if you have plenty of physical RAM, that's great. But the problem will always be somewhere that you're going to use up all of this memory doing something. And at that point, Windows obviously becomes unstable. Windows can't handle it when it runs completely out of memory. And hard drive space there's plenty. There is ample space to be able to take advantage of these things. It's nice to have that, if only as an insurance policy, if you do actually run out of memory. So instead of crashing your operating system, you'll just have it page off to disk. Always a good idea to be able to have that paging information right there. I think it's also a way you can take advantage of some of the speed of an SSD. You're almost using an SSD like real memory. Think of the fast access that you're going to have to an SSD to be able to use that as well. So don't disable it, use it. Take advantage of it. It's there to protect your system and keep things running. I think if you're going to be using a virtual technology like virtual memory, use it as, even if you have plenty of memory, use it as an insurance policy, something you can always be able to use to be able to have that there. Some people in the chat room have said, oh, SSDs, we shouldn't use paging to SSDs. Well, there's no reason why you couldn't. SSDs are there. Back in the day, back in the early days of SSD, where there was extremely limited number of writes that you could do to an SSD, you obviously wanted to minimize how much you were writing to an SSD. But these days, you could be all day, every day, writing to an SSD, and it's going to work that way for years and years and years and years. And obviously, we don't write like that to our SSDs. There's downtime. It doesn't write to every sector of an SSD every minute of the day. You can really start using SSDs to be able to take advantage of some of those things. What you don't want to do in an SSD are things like being able to defragment. There's no reason to defragment an SSD because you don't have any drive heads. There's no physical movement of a drive head going across a disk, and you have to optimize the files on the disk. Memory, it's instantly accessible wherever it happens to be. So that's one of those nice ways to take advantage of the speed of an SSD. Even better to have that paging file there and be able to use. And on my system, that's exactly what I've done, is I set it up automatically. Most technicians and Microsoft themselves, Mark Rusinovich has even said, you should probably have 1.5 to 2 times the amount of physical RAM. Take that number of physical RAM. If you have 2 gig of memory or 4 gig of memory in your computer, double that, or 1.5 times. That should be your virtual memory size. So if you have 4 gig, maybe you have 6 or 8 gig of virtual memory sitting there. Kind of useful to have that there. And if you've got the disk space available, why not take advantage of it? So a great question from William to be able to work with those things. I think whenever I'm working with these virtual memory and configuration settings, I want my Windows to be as performing as well as I possibly can. And that's just one of the ways that I can make that happen. We've got another question that came in from, in this case, I've got a pop quiz question for you, and it is, what is the first software run by a PC when you power it on? there's something that happens the first piece of software that's run. And don't answer in the chat room. You don't want to say what that is, but you can absolutely go to vot.rs and go to 408294 to answer the question of what's the first software run by a PC when it's powered on. And I have a number of options. I have NT Loader, the Windows bootloader. I have BIOS, WinLogon, and I have MBR. So there's 4 options available to you to choose from what the first software is when you power on your PC that's run, when you start it up. There's something that begins, and something has to start first, and then second, and then third, and fourth. So what's the first one? What's that first thing on there? While we're doing that, some questions in the chat room. Do you want the paging file off of your location, the operating system, onto another disk? That may provide you with a minimal, or in some cases, maybe even a better performance advantage. That's one of those things where you need to look at what memory is there, or what disk space is there. Is that disk something the operating system's not paging to? Maybe it's something that you have plenty of memory, plenty of space available, so you can use that as virtual memory. The disk itself is one you need to decide how much you're using the virtual memory. If you're not using virtual memory very much, you have a lot of RAM and it's hardly paging out, then it doesn't really matter where you put the drive. But if you're using virtual memory a lot, maybe that will help to be able to have that available. So we've got a number of respondents to what is the first software that is run by a PC when it is powered on. And if you go to vot.rs and vote at 408294, we've got about 52. You're now really asked 55 respondents. Let's see what people say when we choose the answer, and the answer, or at least the highest number of votes, is BIOS. I really didn't fool very many people there either. 46 of you said BIOS. 6 of you said the Windows NT Loader. The master boot record is certainly the first sector on an MBR-related hard drive. 8 of you said that, but that's not software that we're looking to run first thing. There is code in there, certainly, but it's not the first thing that runs. The first thing that runs is the basic input-output system on your computer, which brings up a good point. Whenever you're talking about BIOS, this is the first video. The first topic on the first 220.801 is all about the BIOS. There's a reason they made it the first set of topics, is because that's the first thing that your computer does. So the question that came in from Manu is, when is it a good time to flash the BIOS, and why? Why would I do that? When would I be able to get with that BIOS? And we even go through the videos and describe how to flash the BIOS, but I don't really talk, well, I talked a little bit actually about exactly when you would want to do this. I used to have a computer, and whenever a new version of the BIOS would come out, I would flash it. I felt compelled to be able to go out and flash that BIOS. Need to update it immediately and have it available there. Of course, I go way back when we couldn't have flashed BIOSes. You couldn't just plug a disk into your computer and update the BIOS. You had to remove a chip and replace a chip. In fact, it looked a little bit like these. Here's that AMI BIOS that's on there, or a chip like the one that's on the bottom, that you had to physically remove it. These days, of course, it is electrically erasable, programmable read-only memory, and we don't have to go through the process of doing that. I like having that newer style flash. We've just become so accustomed to doing that. We can simply add software to our computer and tell it, go out and update the flash, will you? This happens all the time on my computer. It updates the operating system updates. I make sure it goes in and gets updates to my hardware and the firmware associated with my video card or associated with my Bluetooth adapter. It changes it completely. And in the chat room, I have to agree with what Robert is saying. These days, you don't really change the BIOS unless there's a really good reason. It's not part of a normal maintenance process. The BIOS is performing a very basic input-output system. It performs a very basic function, and it is responsible for that communication between the computer and you, and it gets things going. And if it's working, great. There have been some very specific versions when working with a BIOS where you might want to consider upgrading because there's a fix for a problem you've run into. I was working with an older server back in the day, and there were files that were being corrupted on the server. And the manufacturer said, yeah, there's a BIOS fix for that, so it won't corrupt files. That was obviously a big, big problem with doing that. Now, you can't just also think about upgrading and thinking things are going to go perfectly either. You have to think about during the BIOS upgrade process things that might go wrong. So before you upgrade, make sure you read through the documentation and understand what the changes are. Most manufacturers will provide you with release notes that will tell you exactly the things you need to know about what has changed. You may be thinking you're fixing one problem, but you may be modifying the way something else works. So think about that as well. Also, this is a pretty important one. Make sure you find a reliable power source and plug in. You do not want anything to go wrong in the middle of the BIOS process. In the chat room, they've already talked about some motherboards these days, especially bigger, more high performance devices, have multiple BIOS inside of them. So you can upgrade one, and if there's a problem, you can fail back to the older BIOS, which is a great idea. That's fantastic. Unfortunately, it's a very small percentage of motherboards that allow that. So as you're upgrading, you don't want to run into a situation where you've now plugged into memory, or you're plugged into power, or maybe you're on battery, and now in the middle of the BIOS update, it fails. It stops. You lose power. Something happens. There's a glitch in the power, and you now have a brick. You now have a system that has no basic input operating capabilities whatsoever. You turn it on, there's no software there to pull from, and there's no software to pull from, so therefore you can't load the operating system that you can use to then update the BIOS. It's a bad time when that happens. You do not want that. So make sure that if you are on a laptop computer, which has a battery inside of it, that's great, plug into power. That way, even if you lose power, the battery's still running. If you have a UPS environment, make sure you're plugged into UPS on your desktop, just to make sure. Probably not going to be a problem until it is. And then you have to figure out what you're going to be able to do with that. Most BIOS applications are now something you just run in the operating system. We used to have to get the BIOS applications, and it wouldn't run in the OS. They gave you a file to download that you had to put on some removable media, like a floppy disk or a CD-ROM. You had to burn the BIOS upgrade and boot from that disk. It was a little bit tedious to make that happen. These days, it's a lot easier. In fact, I've got an example of this on the Windows machine that I have in front of me. Let's get rid of all these screens and things that I have up. Here is some BIOS software. It's not really the BIOS software for this, so I'm not going to do a real BIOS upgrade, but these are the types of executables you would download. You go to the manufacturer of your motherboard, and you put in the specific model of your motherboard, and it will tell you, here are the BIOS versions available for you to download and what you can use. And I've just downloaded one here from Dell. And when I run it, it of course gives me the great Windows access control, user access control. It says, hey, you're going to upgrade this particular system. This is an executable. I haven't seen it before. Is it okay to run this? So we get that option just in case it happened to be something that was not good, that we were not supposed to be running. It's not a bad guy. This really is a BIOS that I downloaded it directly from the manufacturer, another important consideration. And here it is. It's this version of the BIOS. It's for a laptop, but you get the idea. And if I hit continue, it says, where do you want to unzip the files? It's like a normal installation program. Yeah, let's create that. They were successfully unzipped. And then it shows me the executable that was created when it was unzipped. In fact, there's the version information that tells you here's what is in this file. And if we were to run it, and indeed it tells me here is the program to upgrade the BIOS. Now, obviously, I'm not going to run my upgrade on here to upgrade this system BIOS. It would not work anyway. The BIOS program does a check, and it makes sure before it upgrades a BIOS that it really is the BIOS for this system. So obviously we'll hit continue and see what happens. In fact, it tells us, what do you want to do? Oh, sorry, you can't do this. It's not compatible with the current system. But here's what it was doing. Notice it was going through. First thing that it did was, notice it says, please do not interrupt. Not a good idea. We loaded the new BIOS. We analyzed the old and new BIOS compatibility. We read the old BIOS. We saved the old BIOS to a backup file. It started to flash, and then it said, wait a second. This is not even close to being compatible. I know, because I'm in this virtual machine. It's not going to upgrade the BIOS. This doesn't match the system BIOS part number, gives an error code, and tells you to go do something else. But that's the process. Normally, it would very quickly go through, update this piece of it, and my BIOS would be updated, and it would reboot my computer. So that is the process of upgrading. It seems very simple, and it is, to upgrade a BIOS and very simply get things running like that. But I think it's also very important to keep in mind what you're doing when you're working with those BIOS configurations. Be very particular, understand the steps, and if you take the proper precautions, you're going to be fine. There's not going to be a problem with that BIOS update. Very, very useful to have those actually there. So I have another question for you. Again, do not answer in the chat room, but of course, I have more questions for you. This one is specific around networking. There were a number of networking questions that came in. This one is, which of these port numbers would be used by an email application? So I didn't say what the application is. In fact, you're going to have to know port numbers, and you're going to have to know the applications associated with those port numbers. And I have just a number of port numbers put into the answer. Again, don't answer in the chat room. So we have UDP 53, TCP 22, TCP 110, TCP 23, TCP 3389. It's quite a few port numbers to choose from. If you go to vot.rs and choose 823595, which is exactly what I have here, you will be able to vote and see if you know which one of these port numbers is used by an email application. Would be nice to know. So this is one of the challenges, of course, when getting into the networking side, really of anything. This is specific to A+, but whether you're going to the Network Plus certification later or you're doing Security Plus, there's a lot of things to memorize. And if you work with port numbers, you work with firewalls, you work with your personal firewall on your computer, you look at the configurations of the applications that you're running, after a while, this will become very commonplace. And you'll know right off the top of your head what port numbers do what. But one of the challenges, especially initially, as you're working through these technologies, is it's just a bunch of numbers when you start out. It's almost like a rote memorization. So if you're working towards understanding more about port numbers, look at the applications you're running. Look at the firewall configuration on your computer. Set up differences in how these firewalls work. Add some rules that might restrict access of certain applications to work and see what happens. It becomes very useful to apply those. It helps you learn what those are when it's something more applicable. We've got a lot to choose from. Port numbers that would be used by an email application: UDP 53, TCP 22, TCP 110, TCP 23, and TCP 3389. So let's see if we can remember. This is kind of a two-step question, isn't it? You first have to know what port numbers are associated with what. But if you've ever looked at the list of port numbers, it's a lot of acronyms. You have to know which acronym is associated with an email application. So I threw in an extra little twist into the question. Let's see what the responses are. And again, most of you got the answer, which is TCP 110. So UDP 53, TCP 22, TCP 23, and TCP 3389 are not the correct answers. All right, so what are they? And what is TCP 110 if that's not quite what I'm looking for? In fact, Wesley asks this month, are there any helpful mnemonic devices or ways to help remember important port numbers? And there's not really mnemonics necessarily, but there is just a very specific group of port numbers that you would need to know for the A+ exam. If you go out and look at a list of port numbers, you could list out pages and pages and pages and pages of port numbers. You don't need to know all of the port numbers in the world and what their common use is. You just have to know very specific port numbers. Now, before we get into what those port numbers are, I will give you exactly the ones you need to know for A+. But before we get there, let's talk about port numbers. They are TCP and UDP protocol uses these things called port numbers, and they could be a number between 0 and 65,535. There's also a term you may hear called ephemeral port numbers and non-ephemeral port numbers. Ephemeral meaning something that's temporary. It's an ephemeral number that we're going to take advantage of, and non-ephemeral obviously would be non-temporary. It'd be more permanent port numbers. Those are the ones where you're generally talking about. These are used so that your client can talk to a server. If you want to talk to a web server, your browser knows what port number the web server is communicating on, and both of you can communicate over that particular port number. It's useful to know what that port number is then. If I need to go to a web server, wherever that web server is in the world, my client that I'm running on my computer is hoping that that web server is set up to use what we call the well-known port number. We're expecting the web server to be offering its service on TCP protocol port 80. If a web server is set up to use a different TCP protocol, we won't know how to access that until we talk to the person in charge of that web server and saying, you're not using port 80 like the rest of the web servers in the world. What are you using? Oh, port 81. Well, now you have to configure your browser or change the URL that you're using at the top of your browser to use that other port number. What a pain. We wouldn't be able to access the web server. That's why all the web servers use TCP port 80, because all the browsers expect it to use TCP port 80. The TCP port numbers, although they are the same numbers between 0 and 65,535, those protocols work very, very differently. And we won't talk about the specifics of TCP and UDP in this particular study group, but it is an important consideration that you will need to understand for the A+ certification. And certainly you can go out and watch the other Professor Messer videos for that. And that's why in your client, you might have a machine sitting out here. It's going to access TCP port 80. On your side, you're going to pick another number to use, just a temporary port number to use, an ephemeral number that's TCP 1331. Usually our devices go in order, although it can jump around. But it might 1330. This is now 1331. The next one would be 1332. It's going to talk back and forth to this web server on port 80. There's other port numbers open on this server. We're not taking advantage of them. This server is using UDP port 53 for DNS. We've got TCP port 443 for encrypted web traffic. My machine, though, is only talking to that server on TCP port 80. So you can see we can layer on many, many different services on a single device and just specifically ask for that particular service by referencing the port number. Makes it very easy to load up a computer. It's doing a lot of different things at one time, and we can simply access it through DNS on port 53 in UDP. We can go to in the clear web server on port 80 or encrypted on port 443. The server's one server. We can also save resources that way as well. So we've got a number of things to work with. But if we look at the ports that we need to know, and you need to go to the CompTIA exam requirements and look at the ports that you need to know, this is what they are. So you've got TCP port 20 and TCP port 21. We're going to go through all the TCP ports first. And 20 and 21 are used for FTP. In many cases of FTP, these are used for data and control. There's other types of FTP that use other port numbers, but for the purposes of the A+ exam, you only need to know that port 20 and 21 with TCP are associated with the FTP, the file transfer protocol. Telnet, which is our console-based view into devices, and this is a in the clear or non-encrypted console view, is done over TCP port 23 using the Telnet application. We've got SMTP, which is a mail application. It's used to transfer mail between mail servers. In fact, this is one that if this had been in that previous question, when I asked you on that question, which of these port numbers would be used by an email application, notice that I don't have TCP 25 on here. But if I did, that would have been a valid answer. The one that I did have available, we'll talk about in just a moment, DNS, the domain name services, generally runs on UDP, but if you're doing very large transfers of DNS information, it will put those into TCP packets. We also have HTTP, our web traffic hypertext transfer protocol over TCP port 80. The POP3, which was the answer to our question, was POP3, Post Office Protocol version 3. We use that a lot for our clients to be able to download and view the mail information in our clients. And we've also got a couple of others. IMAP runs on TCP 143, and IMAP is a messaging protocol, yet another email protocol that we need to know about for the A+ exam. Notice all the email protocols. There is SMTP, there's POP3, and there's IMAP. So any one of these could have been a valid answer to that question. HTTPS is the encrypted version of HTTP over TCP port 443. And finally, remote desktop protocol, the RDP that we would use to remotely access other computers, runs over a TCP protocol commonly seen on port 3389. It's a lot of TCP protocols you'd have to know, but a lot of these we work with day to day. So if you've done anything with web services, you already know port 80, port 443. If you have done Telnet type access to a device, TCP port 23. If you need to memorize UDP protocols, it's a lot easier. There's only one. This is it, DNS. Domain name services almost always will use UDP over port 53 to do its queries to find out the IP address of a server, or reverse DNS, be able to understand what a server name if all you have is an IP address. There's a lot going on there. So I don't know that there's a good mnemonic there. There's such a large list of names into this mix. If I back up a couple, here we go. It's big. That's a big list. You just really need to be able to understand exactly what this is looking for and the types of information. This is one of those flashcard rote memorization, or work with some labs. Get in there and get into the application itself. And I think that is a very good way to work with those pieces and be able to use those. Have a few. The chat room mentioning TeamViewer, that is a remote desktop type application that may not necessarily be using the RDP, which is a very specific kind of remote desktop protocol that is made by Microsoft. Other types of remote access applications, and there's many, are VNC, TeamViewer, Go to My PC. Those types of things may have a completely different mechanism for its communication process. So you also want to keep in mind what some of those might be using. They might not be using the RDP protocol. They might be using a completely different protocol associated with that. So in the chat room, a lot of folks have put on cheat sheets about port numbers. Just keep in mind, those are very big lists of port numbers. You only need to know the ones I listed here. So don't go through trying to memorize 50 port numbers and what they are. Go to your exam objectives and know immediately you'll have a very specific list. Very quickly, you'll know exactly what you need to know for those pieces. And I don't know that these third-party applications may use RDP. They may use the remote desktop protocol to do this, but I don't know that for sure. You'll have to check with that third-party application and see exactly what it is using for its remote desktop. Then you'll have a pretty good idea of that. One of the questions that came in, this is a question I get all the time. This one came from Crystal and says, what kind of tools can I use to help prepare myself for the A+ exam? And this is a very, very common question, primarily because we have a lot of things that we have to know. And generally, I always recommend that you do things like get a good book. You should absolutely be familiar with the videos that I have, but you'll also want to get a good book to go into this mix as well. And as you probably also know, if you've watched my A+ study groups before, is I work a lot with GTS Learning. They're a group that has a ton of great study materials. And this month, again, they've given us some great tools to use. If you go out to professormesser.com, in this case, you can't even see the link that I've added there, but the link is professormesser.com/fast-track. And they have a new set of fast track books available. These are A+ study guides available. These are official courseware from CompTIA. CompTIA has looked at this book and says, yeah, this is absolutely a book that people could use to be able to learn what they need to know for their A+ certification. My videos are embedded in the book. So you can go to the book, and inside of there are QR codes. Again, a great use of QR codes. So as you're reading the book, you can scan in the QR code and your mobile device will start playing my video. Or if you have this in ebook form, which is the one that's here, this price down here is for the ebook version, you simply click on it, it takes you to the appropriate video. So you don't have to jump around with all those videos. This is for our 800 series exams. You can, of course, get that in a print form. If you're somebody who likes that printed book, you can take that printed book with you. You don't like it in an ebook form, you can certainly do that. And they've included exam questions. There's a part of this on the GTS Learning site. They're taking their freestyle capabilities and adding them in with this. So when you get the book, you get all the advantages of what you have on freestyle. You can learn all about that offering if you go out to professormesser.com/fast-track, and you can learn and even download a sample of what you might get there. If you were to look at that, you would be able to see something like this. This is the Fast Track book. They gave me a copy of it. Again, it is a CompTIA official. Got the nice list on there, and they step through in the table of contents practically everything you will want to know to be able to see and learn about the CompTIA exam. You'll notice that this is in a different format, a different numbering system than my videos. And I think I've said this in other study groups. One of the challenges you have when I'm making videos is that you can't find anything. There's so many videos, it's hard to find exactly what you're looking for. In fact, they don't read very well as a book. You really want to change the format if you're reading this as a book, and that's exactly what GTS Learning has done. If I scroll down through this, they not only have a breakdown in text of what you'll need to know, but they have a huge number of graphics, which I think is incredibly important when you're trying to learn things about the A+ exam. Some of us don't have access to hardware, and you don't necessarily need access to hardware to be able to do things on your A+ certification, but it's nice to be able to see them. It's nice to be able to have that visual feedback. And in this book, they've got a lot of breakdowns of the things that you need to know about. When they describe things like a static wrist strap, they show you what that looks like. Here's the static mats. So you do get a nice idea of those pieces. It's a nice resource. And if you're somebody who's looking to take advantage and learn more about the A+, a very good book, something that you may be able to work with that can really provide you with a nice overview of A+, and you get some great questions and answers in there too, which I think are important as well. We've got questions about the A+ exam as well. So not only do we talk about technical things in this study group, you ask questions about the exam itself and how it operates. And I have some of those questions here. One is, when will XP be removed from the A+ exam since it will be discontinued soon? Billy asks. And it's also a very valid question, I think. That's one of those things we're always worried about what we're studying and is it going to be removed from the exam. Obviously, Windows XP is one of the most popular operating systems of all time. It is probably on this enormous list, at the top of a list of all of these operating systems, of the enormous implementations, the number of workstations running Windows XP. And Microsoft has indeed delayed the time that they would support Windows XP over and over again. But now they've said, no, in April, we're going to get rid of our support. You're not going to get those things together and be able to work with them. I think that's where now you get into worrying about, where do I go to be able to get those things and be able to see the updates? We'll talk more about that in just a moment. But because of the popularity of Windows XP, I don't personally see it being something that will be discontinued anytime soon. So I don't think you're going to have to worry about that if you're planning to take the exam anytime in the next year. And in the chat room, they go, yeah, it's going to be around forever. Windows XP will be with us till the day we die. It sure seems that way. It's been around on so many different computers. Just keep checking your study, go out to the topics, the objectives that you need to study in CompTIA. I think that's going to be your best choice to be able to work with those. That is one that I think would be extremely useful for you to be able to take advantage of. And then whenever I'm working with and planning to take a certification, that's one of the first places I go, is to make sure they are on there. So there is quite a few also topics that Amanda's asking about, and she's asking, how well tailored are the objectives to the actual exam? I've said over and over now, are you go to the objectives, download the objectives, go out to CompTIA and get those objectives. The real question is, are they really that close to what we should be working with? And I think that's a valid question. We will want to know if we're going to be using these objectives as a primary study source. Are they that good? So let's talk about objectives. I've said this over and over in the study group, so it may be worthwhile to talk about, which is to download them and read them. And I use them as a checklist. This is one of the best places you can go to understand exactly what will be asked of you. So if you want to know if there is a Windows 8 on the exam, this is where you go. If you want to know exactly what port numbers you need to learn, this is where you go. If you want to understand what RAID types I need to be aware of, this is where you would go. If we were to look at the CompTIA site, it would look something like this. And if you go up to the top, you can see tabs for certification. You could certainly Google just A+ certification and go to that piece. And when you get there, you'll get a big list of all of the certifications available. So I want to get certified. I want to get my A+ certification. And one of the things that CompTIA has done recently is right in the middle of the screen, the very first thing they give you is view exam objectives. They also have sample questions here too. So if you ever wanted to go through and see how well do I know some of this content, that'd be a great place to get a few questions to try out. Let's view the exam objectives. We'll take you to this exam objectives page, and you can add your information in here, and everybody can send me an email. It's not too hard there. I am in the United States. My exam objective already chose A+ because that's where I came from. But if you wanted others, you can certainly choose those exam objectives as well. And I want to get the exam objectives. You can, of course, fill in this other information if you'd like to about indicate your training status and those pieces. And now it brings me up to the exam objectives. The 800 series will be at the top. 700 series, of course, underneath that. There are places in the world that are still giving the 700 series until the end of the year, non-English speaking and outside of North America. The objectives are right here. What I'd like to know is the 801 and 802. And if I click on those, pop open a new window here, I'll hold down my shift key, click on that. Here are the objectives. They tell you exactly the percentage of information you're going to need to know for the exam, and it steps through in detail every bit of information you need to study from for the certification. That is extremely important when you start going through this, because they tell you the BIOS configurations. You need to know how to handle the boot sequence. What is that about? What is involved in understanding the boot sequence? How do you enable and disable devices in your BIOS? How do you configure the date and time? Where are the clock speeds set? How about virtualization support in your BIOS? And especially things like BIOS security, which is an odd option under virtualization support. I think that's probably a separate bullet over here. And BIOS security, passwords, drive encryption, TPM, and LoJack. So if you look at my video, you'll notice it goes exactly along with these exam objectives. That's where I'm getting my information from. So it's a great place that you could go and get information from yourself. Very, very useful to have those pieces available. This is a great checklist. I will sometimes, if it's a very complex exam, print out the list of exam objectives, and I will simply cross through the things that I know pretty well. Yep, I know that good enough for the exam. Helps you understand where you should be focusing your study efforts. Should I know more about the virtualization support in the BIOS? I know nothing about that. Let me circle it. Let me highlight it. Let me go learn more about what virtualization support is all about when working with BIOS configurations. And you can do that for the entire list. This is everything. Now, they do say at the top of this that this list are not exhaustive lists. They warn you that there may be other things included on the exam. It's not actually true, though. They stay pretty close. It's extremely unusual for you to be in an exam and not find this. And that's why I always say this is an exceptionally good list. If they ever go through and go outside of this list, it's very often to ask you a question that you won't actually be graded on. Everything on here and what I have found, this is really something the lawyers put in there, but what I have found on their exams, they follow this list extremely well. So if I did nothing but study to this list, I'm going to pass the exam. Maybe one question might be outside the scope, but I bet knowing everything on this list, I would be able to even figure that piece out. But in my past experiences in taking the exam, they stay right on the money with this. So if you did nothing but use this as your study list, you're going to do just fine on passing your A+ certification exam. They're always going to give you some other things. That's an interesting thing to bring up. They ask you questions that aren't in this list. And they even say at the beginning of the exam, and they might even say in their exam objectives as well, we may ask you things that aren't even in here, but we don't count those against your score. They don't work for your score either. They aren't counted at all. But they do have sample questions they'd like to send you. Maybe you'll get some Windows 8 questions on your exam. Those aren't going to count right now. They're not in their exam objectives. They're not going to expect you to know about Windows 8 when they've never said anything in the world about Windows 8. But they love to be able to see what your answer will be, so that they can decide maybe they'd like to include that question in a later version of the certification. So keep that in mind. It can be really useful to use those objectives, not just with CompTIAs, but really any exam you're going to take. Try to understand exactly what is expected of you. You're going to be just fine. Marcus asks a question that says, or this is Steve's question rather, what if I don't have access to computer products? What if I don't have a computer, a desktop that I can open the front of it and look inside and play around with what's inside of it and look at the memory? I've only got a laptop. Can I still take the A+? Is this still going to be useful? And I think it is. I think that's one of the things that the A+ is your entry level into understanding technology. If you have a desktop computer and you can actually take the memory out and put it back in, it does give you more of that visceral understanding of exactly how that's done. But if you look at the pictures of how it's done, and in my videos I show you how I put it in there and I put it down and the little tabs come in, you get some pretty good views of that, but it's just not the same in touching it. You can pass the certification for A+ without doing hands-on. There are other certifications you will take in your lifetime of IT where you absolutely have to have some hands-on. But for the A+, it's not a huge requirement. It helps. It absolutely helps to have that. But sometimes people just don't have access to those. It's not like you have extra hardware sitting around you can use. It's okay. You don't have to have that. You don't have to build a computer to be able to pass the A+ exam. There's folks that have sent me emails and said, I got a bunch of parts and I'm building my computer and now I'll be ready for the A+. You probably don't need to go that far. It will help because you'll know what the power supply is like and where it fits on the motherboard and where the motherboard plugs in, and you'll be able to understand all of those components on the motherboard. But I've got videos that can take you through that as well. So just another consideration when you're thinking about what to study from, what you should have there, just another thing to think about. The question from Marcus, mentioned this earlier, is what kind of career path is good once you have an A+, a Network Plus, one of the Microsoft certifications? This comes up quite a bit as well because you've now gone through this entire process of getting the certifications. And generally, you don't get all of these all at once. Usually you start with an A+, maybe you get your Network Plus, you get your entry level into an organization. If you're already working with Windows operating systems, you would probably not go back and get an A+ certification because that won't help you. Usually we get certificates to help you move up through your career. The A+ may be required by an employer. Maybe that's why you're getting it. And sometimes we like to get certifications just to learn something. Every time I've done a certification, even if it's a topic that I've worked with in the industry for years and years and years, I sit down and I learn something when I go through that, or it refreshes what I know about those pieces, about the technology, about the hardware. Oh, that's the way it works. It's remarkable how much we tend to just plug things in and use the operating system and not really understand how the paging file actually works. And going through and creating slides for you on how to understand the paging file and reading more about the paging file and looking at the controversy online. People say don't use the paging file. People say do use the paging file. Wow, this week I learned something about the paging file. The things you don't actually get into that deep. You can go deep, deep, deep with these technologies. So once you start getting these, though, I think once you get your A+, and I think Network Plus is a good one to have because everything in IT touches the network, now you start to make a decision on what you like to do. And generally, we like to be able to go out and maybe if you love databases, maybe you want to be a database administrator. If you love servers and operating systems, maybe the Microsoft certifications are good. Maybe you have a large virtualization contingent of servers and devices in your environment. Maybe the VMware technologies are good. Maybe you want to go into networking, so you go into the large networking companies and their certifications. Maybe cloud technologies is good. Maybe you get into those types of pieces. Maybe Linux is where you want to go. You want to administer Linux servers and work with those. There's a big requirement for very knowledgeable Linux people. Maybe the Linux Plus certification, the LPI series of exams is for you. So really, once you get your A+ and you learn about what's out there, most people see what's interesting to them. For me, it was, I started with operating systems, but networking really pulled me in. I shifted away from Windows desktop and into networking. And then from networking went into security. So it's never also locked in stone. You usually start with a set of technologies and then technologies change. This idea of the internet was something that could never have been thought of whenever I was in college. When I got my college degree and I got out and said, I'm going to do something with technology, and this happened, I would have never thought in a million years that I would have this on my desk and a camera and be talking directly to whoever would like to see it in the world, to be able to watch a live stream of whatever I happen to be showing on my computer here. Would never have dreamed it. So you may not even know what's going to happen with technology, but you know what interests you. I knew networking was interesting. I knew the internet was fascinating. I knew that being able to understand how things work at a packet level was where my brain worked. Maybe that's good, maybe that's bad, but that's where I sat. So as you think about that question of what career path is going to be good, it's the career path that's going to be good for you. The best type of job is the one that you love to do every day, to go in and work with those. I think that's where you need to really concentrate and think about as you're going through your day-to-day. Boy, that networking piece was really fun. Hey, loading up that virtualized environment was great. Wow, setting up these Windows servers in a cluster and working with Active Directory was fascinating. You'll know what direction you should go and try a little bit of everything. You may be surprised at where things go with these technologies. Well, we've come to the end of yet another A+ study group. I want to make you always aware to follow us on Twitter to see everything that we're doing. And I'm getting a little better about telling you what's happening and the things interesting things that I find that might help you with things that you're doing with your technology studies. Of course, go out to YouTube. You can subscribe and get updates for us as well. Again, I want to thank GTS Learning for helping put on these study groups that we do. You can find out more about their books and their online freestyle resources at professormesser.com/fast-track. People say, I want to save some money. I've got vouchers for you. GTS Learning was nice enough to make these vouchers available on my website too. So absolutely go to professormesser.com/vouchers. I keep those updated. I think the one that's there is one that I've got, I think, until the end of the year. So I will keep them updated. There is always a date when they no longer are available. I will make sure that we keep putting those vouchers out there if at all possible. And of course, you can always join us every month for our A+ study groups, our Network Plus study groups. I try to keep my calendar updated. Again, a week from today, we're doing our Network Plus study group for October. Perhaps you'd like to join us there as well. You can find out more at professormesser.com/calendar. And of course, I want to thank you. I would not be able to do these study groups unless you send me your questions, you talk to me during the month, you put some interesting things in the chat rooms, and I'm watching the chat rooms and I make notes. So if somebody's talking about IP addressing or RAID or other technologies, I think that would be a great topic for the study group. So I want to thank you for allowing me to take those ideas and put them up on the screen for everybody. So thanks for joining us again for our study groups. We'll see you next month. Thanks, everybody.